Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is for the astrological chart of John Lennon. I'm speaking very quietly because it's at night and I can't talk too loudly, so I hope that it's not going to be too faint. But John Lennon, one of the Beatles, which I'm sure most people know, unless you're living under a rock, was born on October 9th, 1940 in Liverpool, England. And I have wanted to do this chart for a long time. This is not going to be an in-depth analysis of his chart. This is kind of like something that I have done before, just very cursory glance at his chart for a second, just to give an idea of how much information you can glean from a chart of a famous person, because a lot of times we know some of the backstory and therefore we can kind of confirm it through when we look at the different chart aspects. Knowing what we know about a famous person, we can draw that connection. Whereas if you're an astrologer and you don't know a client from a hole in the wall, you're not going to be able to just act like you have all this information on them. So you have to find it in the chart, and you're not sure if it's going to be correct or not. And hopefully it is accurate, right? So looking at John Lennon's chart, we know that John Lennon was the man who wrote that song that so many people love to this day called Imagine. And even more so, talking about his sun in Libra, Give Peace a Chance, or All You Need Is Love. Libra, his sun sign, is ruled by Venus, and so Venus is a planet that wants harmony. And so Librans tend to be the peacemakers. They tend to be the ones that mediate difficulties between other people. And for some reason, I had always thought that John's rising sign was Taurus. I think I read that somewhere. Maybe they didn't have his exact time of birth. I'm not sure. But everything made sense when I found out last year that his rising sign is actually Aries. Because knowing what I did about his behavior, I knew that he had a very feisty side to him when he was younger. He was intimidating to other people. He did have anger issues, and I figured it had something to do with his moon being in Aquarius. But I now realize that's where that rebellious nature came in. And actually, when the Beatles first got together, he was considered the leader of the band. So because his sun and his rising sign are both in cardinal signs, and he has Mars in Libra as well, so there's another cardinal sign there, it makes sense that he would be the leader of the band. And the fact that he had this triple masculine sun, moon, and rising sign really gave him this image as somebody who, reached out to others. And I think a lot of people admire John because they saw him as very forthright Watch some interviews with him on Dick Cavett, and you'll see exactly what I mean. He was just a fascinating person to interview. I used to read some of his interviews from the Rolling Stone and other publications, and there was always something that was compelling, because he seemed like his own person. He never conformed to what society expected. And as a result, he really stood apart from the crowd, but he also was very controversial. And it's interesting because Libra, as a sign, sometimes goes along to get along. But he was not the typical Libra because of having the moon in Aquarius, which can lead to some very quirky attitudes and even behaviors, which I will get to in a minute, but and preferences, He definitely had an eccentric side to him. And Mercury in Scorpio, the way that he communicated could be harsh. And there were people who bore the brunt of his very cutting words. He had Venus in Virgo, which is interesting because he did have a romantic side to him, but there was a part of him that was such a consummate artist that it was almost like you can see in his 6th house that he has so much energy there. And so this can be the person, especially since Venus and Neptune are in this house, where his life is a work of art. Because remember that the 6th house is the work that you do, but it's also your day-to-day existence. And so he had a sun in the 6th house. He had North Node there. He had Mars, Neptune, and Venus. And so it's like who he was not apart from his, his soul's mission. And I really feel like people who have their North Node and their Sun in the same sign, especially if it is in the 6th house or the 10th house, it's like, their celebrity is what they came here to experience. And so they have to exist as somebody that people think they know. His Mars was in Libra, and so Mars is our drive. It's kind of what we feel compelled to do. So again, with the Libra-related issues, I first and foremost think of his desire to spread the concept of peace during the Vietnam War, and also the artistic angle of being driven to create. And so that's really interesting that he had Mars in one of the 2 signs that is connected to the planet Venus, Libra, and the other one is Taurus. Speaking of that, John had Jupiter in Taurus, he had Saturn in Taurus, and he had Uranus in Taurus. And his Jupiter and Saturn were at exact 13 degrees. each. So Jupiter and Saturn were in an exact conjunction. He had Uranus in Taurus as well. And so let me just talk about those three planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Uranus, all in Taurus, in his first house of the self. And you could say his childhood, because that's how he started his life. When somebody has Saturn in the first house, there can be a hardship. And this would be in the first years of life. And John, until he was 4, actually lived with his mother. And his father was not in the picture fully. He came and went, I can't remember. Yeah, and that was when he was 4 years old. He was asked who he wanted to live with, either I think it was his father or his mother. He chose his mother. And, but she was like a free spirit. She didn't take care of him. He actually ended up living with his mother's sister. And so he has Jupiter in that first house too. So again, you see that Saturn and Jupiter are connected. So even though he had a trauma of being separated from his mother, and his mother ended up getting killed in a car crash when he was a teenager, which is traumatic as well. But he ended up living a middle-class existence. And so it wasn't exactly the perfect start to life, but it's better than some people have it for sure. And Uranus is also in this first house. So when Uranus is in the first house, there may be some kind of instability that is connected to those early years. And that can be also traumatic depending on the person's psychological makeup, or we could look at the astrological chart to determine that. Because John had a moon in Aquarius, and I mean, having those sun, moon, and rising sign all in masculine energy, I think that he handled that kind of unpredictability with ease, because some signs are more susceptible to that kind of back and forth. If he had been a Cancer, if he had been a Taurus, it might have impacted him more profoundly. Some signs are much more capable of handling instability than others. And so I don't think that was the biggest thing with him. His moon is in Aquarius, and the moon can indicate the nature of the mother, what kind of mothering he received. In this case, his mother was actually a sun in Pisces, if I'm not mistaken, Julia. And she was a freewheeling person. She did not raise him in a conventional way. And I think she was quite eccentric, and I think even his father was as well. And so he was, he got this influence from her that was somebody who didn't take life too seriously. And that kind of freedom that she represented was in her parenting style, where she did, it was very unconventional, not the typical mother. And so he grew up probably being attracted to that type of woman because, lo and behold, he met Yoko Ono. And even though he had already been married, and that's when he met her while he was still married to his first wife, she was a stark contrast from other women, to say the least. And Yoko's birthday is actually on February 18th. So I think I will do her chart sometime because that might be interesting as well. Now, I'm assuming she's officially in Aquarius, maybe 29 degrees Aquarius. I don't know if I said 0 degrees. I mean, she could be 0 degrees of Pisces, but I think they have always characterized her as an Aquarius, and she certainly fits the bill in terms of her unusual behavior and artistic style. And one of the things that Yoko would do, which John began participating with her, is something called conceptual art, which was really about the idea of something rather than the aesthetics, whether or not it was, a beautiful painting or a lovely piece of music. So I would say John Cage, because I think Yoko was part of that crowd. If you've ever listened to John Cage's music, which is experimental, it's not supposed to be this melody that you hum. I mean, he uses unusual, objects to even create sound. But it's very meditative, and it's fascinating to listen to some of it. Likewise, Yoko was into a lot of experimental, creative self-expression, and John took to that very well, and I would imagine it's because of that Aquarian energy of his moon sign that craved novelty, or originality, I should say, more than novelty, but originality, and kind of being ahead of its time. So he was somebody who was born to be an artist simply by being someone with the sun in Aquarius and the sun in Libra and having Mars in Libra and having all that Taurus energy in the first house of the self. So the Venusian energy, Jupiter there. So Jupiter giving him luck in Venus-related activities. And his moon not only is in an Aquarius, but it's in Aquarius's house, the 11th house. So this is really great for someone who can emotionally touch the masses. The 11th house, we can talk about technology now. These days, the internet is so much a part of what that represents. But back in the day, before that was the medium to reach people, the 11th house was through the TV screen, the movie screen, and of course, John was in Help and Hard Day's Night, but also, and of course, the famous Ed Sullivan appearances, but also he was in movies. He was in another movie as well, but also in print. The point is that he got his message across in multiple and multimedia ways. And the moon is the emotions, and in the 11th house, it is really connecting with the masses on that emotional level. And I think for celebrities, to have the moon in the 10th house or the 11th house can be quite fortunate for that. Because, when the sun is in the 10th house or even in the 11th house, it can be, I think it could be indicative of celebrity for sure, but it's all about them. When the moon is there, it's more about how do we connect on an emotional level, and how does a person, how do they express themselves in a way that, an artist is really somebody who shares their emotions with the masses. And so this is really great for that. To be honest with you, I find it interesting that John had Chiron and Pluto in the 5th house. Well, not really Pluto, because Pluto is about power and about obsession, and the 5th house is creativity. So it's pretty par for the course, I would think, that somebody who is a consummate artist would have an intense placement, have Pluto in that creative house, because the Beatles were so prolific. And in such a short period of time, I always think about that, and it amazes me, their body of work that they just cranked out, and the quality of it, and how relatively short a time they were together. And so that doesn't really surprise me. It's Chiron. And Chiron, that trauma that relates to, I would say, not necessarily art, because he was very successful in that arena, but love. Could it be love? Because I've read multiple biographies about him, and I think that he was, at the end of his life, not feeling loved by the person that he was in love with. And this is that, to me, it's almost like that unrequited love that I think Chiron represents, or the trauma of an unrequited love. Even though this is the 5th house, I also think that the trauma of childhood, because the 5th house can be childhood, could be evident here. And an example would be the child has to grow up really quickly for some reason. And in this particular case, when he stopped living with his mother, his birth mother, that was very traumatic, and that was probably the first time that he really understood the gravity of life, that sometimes things are not as idyllic as they're made out to be. And so he might have had to grow up very quickly due to his separation from his mother. And I also think that Pluto here could indicate a nature that he has described. He had a song called Jealous Guy, because he said he had been jealous when he was younger. And there's not anything here to really indicate that in his personal planets. As I said, he does have some Taurus in some of these other positions, and Taurus is that sign that is notorious for that. But with his inner planets, the only thing I could think of is the Scorpio, but that's his Mercury sign. So maybe it's just the idea of some, the suspicious nature that kind of takes hold, especially when somebody is young and insecure about relationships in general. That might have been how he expressed that area. In general, because he does have this air energy pretty dominating, air tends to be detached and not particularly jealous. Now the sun, when he was murdered, the sun was in his 8th house. It was transing in Sagittarius. And so his 8th house doesn't contain any planets in it. And this could be the, kind of a hint sometimes of how a person dies, of like what the circumstances are of their death. But of course, with him, all we have to confirm that is the timing. And even in the 12th house, he has no planets either. And this is the house of secret enemies. So I'm not going to get too much into that. I like to focus more on the breakdown of the personality traits more than the timing issues of his life. And because I've kind of gone on now for over 27 minutes, I think I'm going to just stop it for now. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of a celebrity's chart. I have done a couple of these before. I've done one on Stevie Nicks and one on Britney Spears. So I kind of run the gamut. And I do believe both of those are still up on my channel. So in any case, I hope that you enjoyed this, and take care. Bye.